The first thing that felt wrong wasn't the letter itself. It was where it landed. It sat on the passenger seat of my truck, a clean white envelope against dust that never fully leaves a ranch vehicle. No logo I recognized. No return address that meant anything to me. Just my name, written with the kind of printed precision that suggests a system, not a person. I had bought the ranch to avoid systems. The land stretched wide in every direction, stitched together by old fencing and gates that groaned when opened. Dirt roads curved where they felt like curving. There were no sidewalks, no shared walls, no bulletin boards. I'd chosen this place because it promised distance, physical and mental, from oversight. No associations, no committees, no meetings. So when I opened the envelope and read the words Homeowners Association Notice, I assumed it was a mistake. I leaned back against the truck door and read it again, slower this time. The letter explained, in careful language, that my property fell within the historic boundary of an association established decades earlier. It referenced bylaws, parcel maps, and something called continuity governance. The tone wasn't threatening. It wasn't friendly either. It was simply confident. Then I saw the number. The association was demanding $92,000. Past violations, back dues, administrative penalties accumulated over time. According to the letter, these obligations existed regardless of ownership changes. According to the letter, they were overdue. I read that paragraph 3 times, my thumb smudging the edge of the paper. There was no shouting moment, no surge of anger, just a quiet disbelief that settled into my chest and stayed there. The ranch around me hadn't changed. The wind still ran across the open fields, lifting dust and laying it back down again. The gates didn't suddenly feel owned by anyone else. The letter included an invoice, itemized but vague. Non-compliant fencing, unauthorized land use, unregistered structures, plural. I thought of the shed I'd repaired, the corral that had been there longer than I had been alive. At the bottom was a contact name, a woman, an association representative. There was a phone number and an email printed neatly, as if this were just another account to be reconciled. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. For a long moment, I didn't move. I listened instead to the silence I'd paid for, to the space between sounds. This land had never asked me for anything. Now, suddenly, someone else was, and I hadn't even agreed to listen yet. I didn't call right away. The number sat on the kitchen counter for 2 days, tucked under a small stack of property documents I'd promised myself I would organize. Every time I passed it, I felt the same dull resistance. Not fear exactly, more like reluctance to invite something official into a place that had stayed unbothered for so long. Eventually, curiosity did what pressure couldn't. Before reaching out, I pulled the original purchase paperwork from a metal drawer near the back wall. The ranch sale had been straightforward. No disclosures about shared governance. No mention of associations, historic or otherwise. I remembered asking the agent directly whether there were any lingering rules attached to the land. The answer back then had been short and confident. None. I spread the documents across the table and read them again, slower this time. Deeds, surveys, boundary descriptions that leaned heavily on natural markers, trees, dry creek beds, fence lines that no longer perfectly matched the words describing them. There was nothing about an HOA, nothing about fees, nothing about violations waiting in storage like unpaid baggage. That was when I noticed a reference buried deep in an attachment I hadn't paid much attention to before. A short paragraph, almost apologetic in tone. It mentioned legacy oversight entities and advised buyers to conduct independent research on regional administrative histories. It wasn't a confirmation, but it wasn't nothing either. That afternoon, I drove the perimeter of the ranch, following the fence line as it bent and straightened with the land. In some places, the posts were new. In others, they leaned at tired angles, held upright by habit more than structure. Nothing about them felt standardized. Nothing felt enforced. At the far end of the property, where my land dipped toward a stretch of scrub and open field, I noticed a small metal marker half buried near a gate hinge. It wasn't labeled clearly, just a number stamped shallowly, worn by weather. I took a picture of it with my phone and kept driving. When I finally reached out, I chose email instead of calling. It felt easier to keep things measured that way. I explained that I'd recently purchased the ranch, that I had questions about the association's claim, and that I'd like documentation supporting the $92,000 demand. The reply came later that evening. The woman introduced herself politely. Her message was professional, almost rehearsed, but not cold. She explained that the association's authority predated many current property records and that enforcement had been intermittent due to ownership changes over time. The balance, she said, reflected cumulative noncompliance, not personal fault. She attached several files, maps, scans of old bylaws, a ledger that tracked penalties across decades, each line item adding to the total with quiet persistence. As I closed my laptop, the ranch outside remained unchanged. The land didn't recognize dates or ledgers, but the paperwork did, and it was patient. The maps were harder to ignore than the numbers. They arrived as faded scans, edges blurred from being copied too many times, but the outlines were unmistakable. Roads that no longer existed. Property lines drawn straighter than land ever allows. A boundary curve that brushed the corner of my ranch like a fingertip, light but deliberate. I printed them out and laid them on the table, smoothing the paper with my palms as if that might help the lines make more sense. According to the association's documents, my land sat just inside their original perimeter. Not fully enclosed, not central, but included. The language used words like adjacent governance and partial jurisdiction. It didn't claim ownership. It claimed responsibility. That distinction mattered to them. I compared their maps with the survey from my purchase. The newer survey relied on satellite data and physical markers. The older ones leaned on assumptions, where a fence should have been, where a road was intended to go. Somewhere between those two versions of the land, the association had decided authority still applied. I emailed again, careful with tone. I asked how violations could apply to a property that hadn't been actively managed or contacted for decades. I asked when notices had been sent and to whom. Her response came the next day. She explained that notices had been issued historically, though records of delivery were limited. Ownership transitions, she said, often created gaps. The association's position was that obligations attached to the land, not the person. Continuity again? That word kept returning. She suggested a site visit, not an inspection, she clarified, a walkthrough. A way to align records with reality. We scheduled it for later that week. When her car pulled up the dirt road, it looked out of place. Clean, compact, careful. She stepped out with a folder tucked under her arm, boots that had never seen this kind of ground, and a posture that suggested procedure rather than judgment. She didn't comment on the size of the ranch or the distance between structures. She simply introduced herself and asked if I'd like to start near the western fence line. We walked slowly. She paused to take notes. Occasionally, she took photos, always after asking. When she mentioned a non-compliant structure, her voice stayed even. It wasn't accusatory, it was observational, as if she were reading weather data. I asked her how a ranch like this ended up on an HOA ledger in the first place. She stopped walking and looked out over the land before answering. "Boundaries don't always age well," she said, "but systems tend to assume they do." We continued on, the quiet filling in the spaces between official language. The ranch didn't respond to her clipboard, it just stayed where it was. And I wondered how long paper could keep claiming ground it no longer recognized. The site visit ended without conclusions. She thanked me for my time, said the association would review its position, and drove away in a trail of dust that settled almost immediately. The ranch returned to its usual stillness, as if the afternoon had been no different from any other. But something had shifted. Later that evening, I walked the property again, slower than usual. I wasn't looking for violations. I was trying to see the land the way a ledger might. Every fence post became a potential entry. Every structure, a line item waiting for interpretation. That perspective felt unnatural, like translating a language that didn't belong here. The next message from her arrived 2 days later. The tone was unchanged, measured, neutral, but the content had sharpened. The association acknowledged that some of the violations were historically ambiguous, yet maintained that the total balance of $92,000 remained valid under their governing framework. They offered options: a structured payment plan, a formal appeal, or a compliance review that could, over time, reduce certain penalties if adjustments were made to the property. Adjustments. I sat with that word longer than the others. It implied alteration, concession, a quiet reshaping of the ranch to fit rules written by people who no longer walked it. I asked for the appeal process. The documents were extensive, timelines that stretched backward, requirements for evidence that barely existed anymore, statements to be notarized, maps to be reinterpreted. The burden wasn't aggressive, it was procedural, heavy in its own way. I noticed something else buried near the end of the packet: a clause allowing for jurisdictional clarification through independent survey arbitration. It wasn't highlighted, it wasn't recommended, it simply existed, waiting. I asked her about it. Her reply was slower this time. She explained that arbitration was uncommon and costly. It required mutual participation. And she added carefully the outcome might still favor the association, depending on interpretation. But it would clarify authority, I said. Yes, she replied, it would. That night, I stood at the gate near the old marker I'd photographed earlier. I brushed dirt away with my boot until the stamped number was fully visible. It didn't align with either map perfectly. It was older than both. I took another photo and sent it to her, asking if the association had records of boundary markers installed on private land. Her answer came the following morning. She didn't know. Not because she was hiding anything, because the system she represented had moved forward without always looking back. And for the first time since the letter arrived, the demand didn't feel absolute. It felt assumptive. The waiting changed the way the ranch sounded. Not louder, not quieter, just different. Every time the wind moved through the open field, I caught myself pausing as if the land might explain something the documents couldn't. It never did. It just existed, steady and indifferent. Her next email arrived with an attachment titled Preliminary Review Summary. The association had revisited the site notes, compared them against their historical records, and flagged several items for potential reevaluation. The phrasing was careful. Nothing was dismissed. Nothing was conceded. But the total $92,000 was no longer mentioned in the first paragraph. Instead, it appeared deeper in the document, surrounded by qualifiers, subject to adjustment, pending clarification, dependent on jurisdictional scope. I read the summary twice, then once more outside, leaning against the fence while the afternoon stretched without urgency. The land still didn't feel governed, but the process had slowed, just enough to notice. I replied with measured appreciation and asked whether the association would formally consider arbitration. I included the photos of the boundary marker again, along with a short note explaining that my purchase survey showed no overlap with active HOA parcels. Her response surprised me, not in content but in tone. She acknowledged the marker, said it complicated things, explained that older associations often relied on assumptions carried forward rather than confirmed. She didn't defend it. She didn't apologize either. She asked if I would be willing to meet again, this time not on the ranch, but at a neutral location with their records specialist present. I agreed. The meeting was small, a quiet room, a table big enough for paper, not people. She arrived with a slim folder. The specialist brought boxes. They spread out documents, some brittle, some clean, maps layered over maps, notes written in margins by hands long gone. The association's claim rested on continuity, but continuity had gaps. At one point, she traced a boundary line with her finger and stopped halfway through. "This segment," she said, more to herself than to me, "was never updated." The specialist nodded. No argument, just confirmation. They didn't withdraw the demand, but they didn't reinforce it either. The conversation shifted from enforcement to interpretation, from obligation to uncertainty. When I returned to the ranch, the sun was low, casting long lines across the dirt road. The fences stood as they always had. The gate hinge creaked the same way. Nothing had changed outwardly. But the weight of that number, $92,000, no longer pressed from above. It hovered instead, suspended by questions no one had asked until now. The next few weeks passed without urgency. That alone felt unfamiliar. After the first letter, I'd expected momentum, deadlines, reminders, escalations. Instead, there was quiet, occasional emails, requests for clarification. Time stretching again, returning to the pace the ranch seemed to prefer. When the association finally sent an updated notice, it didn't look like the first one. There was no invoice attached, no demand language, just a summary of areas under review and a statement that enforcement actions were paused pending jurisdictional determination. Paused, I walked the length of the eastern fence that afternoon, stopping where the land dipped slightly before rising again. The fence line here followed no obvious logic. It predated plans. It existed because someone once decided it should, and then left it alone long enough for it to feel permanent. That felt important. She called later that week. It was the first time we'd spoken without a script between us. Her voice was still professional, but the edges had softened. She explained that the association's authority had likely never been tested against properties this far out. The assumption had always been that inclusion was implied. Over time, implied had turned into enforced without anyone checking whether it still made sense. "This isn't personal," she said. "It never was." I believed her. She also explained that the $92,000 figure had been generated automatically, based on a model that didn't account for inactivity or lack of notice. It was, in her words, the system doing what it was built to do. "And what happens if the system is wrong?" I asked. There was a pause, not long, just long enough to register. "Then it needs help stopping," she said. The association proposed a formal boundary reassessment, funded jointly. Not cheap, but finite. The outcome would either confirm their jurisdiction or release the property entirely. No retroactive penalties if authority couldn't be proven. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a concession. It was a slowdown. I agreed. As the surveyors worked, small flags appeared along the property edge, bright against muted ground. Temporary markers for a long-standing question. I watched them from a distance, not interfering, just observing how easily uncertainty could be mapped once someone decided to look. When the preliminary results came back, they didn't make declarations. They offered probabilities, overlaps that were less certain than once believed, lines that drifted when remeasured. Her email that night was brief. "This changes our understanding," she wrote. The ranch stayed the same. The wind still moved across it without permission. But somewhere beyond the fence line, a process that once felt immovable had begun to reconsider itself. And that mattered more than any number ever could. The first sign that things were truly shifting came in the form of a shorter email. No attachments, no formal headings, just a few paragraphs written plainly, explaining that the reassessment had introduced material uncertainty into the association's original claim. The words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. Material uncertainty meant the ground wasn't as firm as it had once appeared. I read it while standing near the long fence that cut across the north end of the property. The posts cast narrow shadows, stretched thin by the low angle of the sun. This was usually the part of the day when I checked hinges, walked the line, and listened to how quiet could still be. A routine built around maintenance, not permission. She called later, asking if I had time to talk. We spoke slowly. Neither of us rushed the conversation. She explained that internally there were disagreements. Some board members believed the association should hold its position, if only because it always had. Others felt the documentation no longer supported enforcement, especially at this distance from the original development. "The $92,000 number," she said carefully, "is losing support." I didn't respond right away. I let the words sit where they landed. She went on to say that the association was considering a resolution that would acknowledge the ambiguity without fully dismantling their framework. A release from past violations. A clarification moving forward. No demand for payment tied to years when no contact had been made. It wasn't framed as generosity. It was framed as administrative correction. I asked her what that would look like in writing. She said it would likely be a letter. Quiet, filed, not publicized. A recognition that the ranch fell outside enforceable authority as currently defined. Future governance would not apply unless boundaries were formally redrawn. "And the balance?" I asked. She paused. "It would be closed," she said. "Not forgiven, just closed." After the call, I walked down the dirt road that curved away from the house, following it until the gates and structures fell behind me. Out here, the land widened, the sightlines stretching far enough that perspective softened everything. This was why I'd bought the ranch, not for isolation alone, but for proportion. Problems looked different when placed against space. A few days later, the letter arrived. 1 page. Precise language. It acknowledged that the association could not substantiate historic jurisdiction over the property with sufficient certainty. It stated that no past dues or penalties, including the previously cited $92,000, would be pursued. There was no triumph in reading it, no relief that needed announcing, just a sense that something heavy had been set down, not dropped, and that the land, as always, had waited patiently for people to catch up to it. The letter didn't change the way the ranch looked, but it changed the way I moved through it. I found myself walking slower, not out of caution this time, but out of habit breaking. For weeks, every step along the fence line had carried a quiet calculation. How it might be interpreted, measured, entered into someone else's system. Now that weight had eased, though it hadn't vanished completely. I folded the letter and placed it in the same metal drawer as the purchase documents, sliding it between surveys and receipts like it belonged there all along. It felt important not to elevate it, important not to turn it into something larger than it was. She followed up with a call a few days later, mostly to confirm receipt. Her tone was unchanged, professional, even, but there was something less guarded about the pauses between sentences. She explained that the association would update its internal maps to reflect the clarification, that my property would be marked as non-enforceable pending redefinition. She said it like a technical correction, not a personal one. I thanked her, not out of relief, out of acknowledgement. Before ending the call, she added something unexpected. She said that cases like this forced institutions to confront their own momentum. That systems built to maintain order sometimes forget to ask whether they still serve the places they touch. I don't think we intended to pressure you, she said, but intention doesn't always matter. After the call, I spent the afternoon repairing a hinge that had been sagging long before any letters arrived. The work was familiar, physical, unconcerned with documents. I tightened bolts, adjusted alignment, tested the swing until it moved the way it should. That felt like a small but necessary reclaiming. The ranch returned to its routines. Gates opened and closed. The wind traced the same paths it always had. Even the survey flags were removed, leaving behind nothing but faint impressions in the soil. Yet I noticed how easily authority had nearly settled here without permission, how quietly it had arrived, how confidently it had spoken at first. If I hadn't slowed things down, asked for documents, asked for time, it might have reshaped the place without ever stepping foot on it. That realization stayed with me. The conflict hadn't ended with a victory. No one conceded loudly. No one admitted fault. The association continued to exist. The rules remained somewhere binding other places, but here on this land the assumption had been interrupted. And interruption, I was learning, mattered more than opposition. The ranch didn't need defending anymore. It just needed space to remain what it was, and for now that was enough. The quiet after resolution was different from the quiet before. It wasn't louder or brighter. It simply had fewer edges, the kind of stillness that doesn't wait for interruption. I noticed it most when walking the far end of the property where the land flattens and the fence line disappears into distance. Before, that stretch had felt watched by paperwork even if no one stood there. Now it felt unclaimed again in the best way. A final email arrived from her the following week. Short, administrative. It confirmed the file was closed, the balance set to 0, the property flagged outside enforceable scope unless future boundaries were formally reestablished. No mention of the $92,000 this time. No reminders. No conditions, just closure. I replied with a simple acknowledgement and archived the thread. It felt important not to linger, not to keep revisiting a process that had already taken enough space. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking less about the association and more about how easily authority can drift. How something designed to manage neighborhoods could stretch outward, crossing dirt roads and open land, until it forgot the difference between proximity and permission. Nothing about the ranch invited governance. It wasn't part of a grid. It didn't share walls or entrances. It functioned on distance and self-reliance. Yet the system had reached anyway, not out of malice, but out of habit. That was the unsettling part. I repaired fence posts, checked gates, and walked the same paths I always had. The routines resumed without ceremony. The land responded the same way it always did, by not responding at all. One afternoon, I stopped near the old boundary marker again. I hadn't touched it since the reassessment. I brushed the dirt away and looked at the worn number, thinking about how much weight had nearly been placed on something so small and uncertain. Paper had almost overridden place. I thought about her too, about the way she'd handled the process, not defensively, not personally. She hadn't been the system, she'd just been the voice it used. When the system slowed, she had slowed with it. That mattered. Conflicts like this don't announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly, dressed as routine. They rely on momentum, on the assumption that people won't question what arrives pre-labeled and itemized. This time I had. And now, as the light stretched across the land and faded without hurry, the ranch felt fully itself again. Not because anything had changed, but because something unnecessary had stepped back. Some things return to normal so quietly that it's hard to say when the change is complete. The ranch didn't announce its relief. There was no moment where the air felt lighter or the land felt claimed anew. The fences still stood where they had stood before. The dirt road still curved the same way, cutting across the property without asking permission. The wind moved across the fields exactly as it always had. What changed wasn't the place. It was the weight placed on it. The demand, once printed neatly, once so certain, had arrived as a conclusion. A number on a page. $92,000 presented as inevitable, administrative, settled before I'd ever been asked. For a while, that number had followed me as I walked the land, slipping into moments where it didn't belong. Now it didn't. Not because it had been erased in some dramatic way. Not because anyone declared victory. It was gone because it had been slowed down long enough to be questioned. Long enough to be seen for what it was, a product of momentum, not malice. The association continued on, I'm sure. Files updated. Maps revised. Systems adjusted just enough to absorb what they'd learned without changing their shape entirely. That was never really the point. The point was that the ranch didn't have to bend to assumptions made in rooms it had never been invited into. I still walk the fence lines, still stop at the gates, still check hinges and posts the same way I always have. The routines didn't need fixing. They were never part of the problem. The land responds best to consistency, not control. Sometimes I think about how easily the outcome could have gone another way. How quietly pressure can become compliance when wrapped in procedure. How many places reshape themselves without ever meaning to, simply because no one paused the process. This time someone did, not loudly, not angrily, just steadily. Questions instead of reactions, documents instead of declarations, time instead of urgency, and that made all the difference. The ranch didn't change overnight. It didn't need to. It stayed quiet, independent, open. What arrived as a demand left as a conversation. What felt absolute became conditional. Nothing was resolved all at once. Nothing was celebrated, but assumptions were interrupted. Some conflicts don't end with winners or losers. They end when someone finally slows things down enough to be noticed, enough to be understood, enough to let a place remain what it already was, and sometimes that's the most complete ending there is.